We are live early on Saturday morning with the big news. The 49ers have hired two people in this defensive coordinator search. Now, only one is an actual defensive coordinator for the 49ers, at least in title as of right now. That's Nick Sorensen. We've talked a lot about Nick Sorensen, who was already on the 49ers staff. He has been promoted to defensive coordinator. But the only candidate who interviewed with the 49ers who had play calling experience, he's also now on staff, and that is Brandon Staley, the former Chargers head coach and the Rams defensive coordinator in 2020. Brandon Staley is joining the 49ers likely as the title of assistant head coach. So there's a lot to break down here. Why did the 49ers hire both of these guys? We can get very much into this. It's interesting because there are some parallels to what they did before. They might be trying to correct some mistakes from before. Obviously, Steve Wilks was the defensive coordinator last year. And this is the first key. This is the background of everything. The 49ers defense regressed under Steve Wilks. They were the number one defense under DeMeco Ryans in 2022, and they dropped down to the number 12 defense by EPA per play in 2023. Simply put, the rush and the coverage did not meld well together in 2023. They brought Wilks in to work with the defensive backs, add his new ideas to the secondary, but they also didn't let Wilks bring any of his assistants in because they wanted to keep the front the same. They wanted to keep that 4-3 front, and it ended up just being rather disjointed. And we saw so many times where the rush and the coverage were not tied together for the 49ers. So they fired Steve Wilks at season's end. It had nothing to do with the Super Bowl. It had a lot more to do with the struggles throughout essentially the entire season. They would pop up and then they would get a little bit better when Shanahan, I think Shanahan had a little bit of a more intense hand in the defense than he had in the past. He wanted the defense to be something that he didn't have to worry about nearly as much. So they made the move from Steve Wilks, and they had to decide, who do we bring in that checks the boxes that we need? So the 49ers said, we need somebody who can tie rushing coverage together in a way that it had been tied from 2019 to 2022 under Robert Saleh and DeMeco Ryans. The 49ers said that they really need somebody who can bring a fiery presence to the defense, because that's what both Robert Saleh and DeMeco Ryans did. They said, we need somebody who could run the scheme as it has already worked for us. So that likely meant somebody either from within the building or within the coaching family. They said, we need somebody who understands the game from the linebacker's point of view, because that's where the main disconnect with Steve Wilks was. And a lot of people, when they saw that list of criteria, they said, well, the coaches or the candidates that best match this are either internal guys or somebody like Jeff Ulbrich from the New York Jets, the defensive coordinator who works under Saleh, former 49er. Ulbrich literally checked all the boxes that I just listed. The issue is that Ulbrich was never technically available because Jeff Ulbrich was under contract with the Jets, and it would have been a lateral move to the 49ers. Assistant head coach does not count as a promotion, even though that's the job that Brandon Staley is likely to get with the 49ers. So since somebody like Ulbrich or somebody like Gus Bradley, two 4-3 coaches who are well-versed in the system, were not officially candidates, since the 49ers would have had to gone outside the box and traded for a defensive coordinator, which would have been unprecedented and might have been something that the Jets or the Colts weren't even interested in. The 49ers instead interviewed a slew of internal candidates, and they also interviewed an external candidate in Brandon Staley. A couple other external candidates too, obviously, with David Merritt of the Chiefs and Gerald Alexander, the defensive backs coach, who's currently with the Raiders but was recently with the Pittsburgh Steelers. But anyway, they decided to have this hodgepodge of candidates, and John Lynch made it really, really clear over the course of the interview process that the 49ers would be gleaning ideas from candidates even if they didn't hire them as the defensive coordinator. And we have seen that come to full fruition now, that the 49ers have promoted Nick Sorensen and hired Brandon Staley. Staley is a Vic Fangio disciple. He runs a 3-4. So a lot of people, when the 49ers were first talking about Brandon Staley being a candidate, a lot of people are saying that doesn't make a lot of sense. The 49ers just brought in an outside guy in Steve Wilks, and it didn't really work out. So Staley, who runs the 3-4, obviously he was under Fangio previously. Fangio was the 49ers defensive coordinator about 10 years ago before the Shanahan-Lynch era. People said, well, why would Shanahan try to fit a square peg into a round hole again? Well, now we have our answer of how the 49ers are going to go about things. Staley can take his cloud coverage concepts, which are disguised coverages. He really did a good job with those with the Rams in 2020 in his lone year as a defensive coordinator, and with the Chargers, even though he wasn't a good head coach. Obviously, the Chargers fired him. They weren't, as a team, performing well enough for the past 3 seasons. But Staley can take a lot of his defensive game planning success and help infuse it into what the 49ers are doing without changing the fundamental structure of the 49ers system. It was a big pain for the 49ers to acclimate Steve Wilks to the structure of their system. Kyle Shanahan made him come out early last year. He said, don't bring any of your assistants. Essentially locked him in a room and said, okay, you have to watch tape, learn what we do here, learn our ethos. They don't have to do that anymore because Nick Sorensen, who's already been on staff over the past 2 years, he's going to be the main defensive play caller. You bring in Staley, who obviously wasn't able to get a defensive coordinator or a head coaching job this offseason, so he wanted to stay relevant. Still too young of a coach to sit out a year like somebody like Bill Belichick or maybe even Pete Carroll. So Brandon Staley is going to be able to take what he has worked on over the years, and he's going to be able to infuse it within the structure of the 49ers defense. It sounds vaguely familiar to what the 49ers had set up last season, except the new guy is not the defensive coordinator this time. It's the existing guy, the guy who's already been on staff. Nick Sorensen is the defensive coordinator, and Brandon Staley will be able to infuse some of what he's doing in with what Nick Sorensen is calling. Now, you might wonder up here what's going on. The ball father and Michael Vick's predecessor at quarterback. Well, Nick Sorensen played QB in college, or initially at Virginia Tech. And the next QB after him, the guy that forced Sorensen to move from quarterback to the defense, where he played safety for the Hokies, was Michael Vick. So just to give you an idea of some time perspective here. And I think that's cool. I mean, Michael Vick in college, he took college football by storm, obviously, then went on to the NFL. But Nick Sorensen was Virginia Tech's quarterback and a player of the game in a bowl game at QB before Michael Vick took over as starter. Now, Sorensen has been with the 49ers over the past 2 seasons. He's been a defensive assistant for them, and last year he got the promotion to defensive pass game coordinator. But over that entire time, he has been nicknamed the ball father in the 49ers facility. Why? Because he runs weekly meetings called The Ball. Those meetings focus on the importance of gaining takeaways and avoiding giveaways. He runs tape cut-ups from around the league and points out little details that the 49ers should either strive for or avoid when it comes to taking care of the football. Over the course of time that Nick Sorensen has been the ball father running these meetings called The Ball, the 49ers have led the league in turnover differential. They've been really good in 2022 and 2023. And one can argue that generating takeaways and avoiding giveaways might be the most important part of football as far as correlation to winning. So Nick Sorensen's played a really, really important role in that. I even got a chance to write about that at the end of the 2022 regular season. Meanwhile, Brandon Staley, I think we need to look at his track record against the Kansas City Chiefs. He was 2-4 against the Chiefs, but would have been 3-3 had Justin Herbert not thrown a 99-yard pick six. And the point is that we need to look at Brandon Staley's defensive track record. And, you know, one thing that Ted Nguyen did a really good job. Ted Nguyen is our Chargers writer for The Athletic, did an awesome job breaking down some of the schemes, some of the cloud coverages that Brandon Staley runs. This came out January 10th, 2023, so a year ago. And as you can see in the title, Chargers Brandon Staley is polarizing, but his defensive game planning is elite. He actually gave the Chiefs a whole heck of a lot of trouble, even though the Chiefs were obviously a better overall team than the Chargers if we're just looking at the defensive side of things. And then we got to talk about Brandon Staley's 2020 Rams defense. That was the only time that he was an NFL defensive coordinator. That Rams defense ranked number one by a lot. Like, I mean, there was a gap between the Rams and everybody else in that 2020 season. Even though, you look at those Rams and then you look at the 2021 Rams and you look at the 2019 Rams, good defenses throughout. Obviously, the Rams in 2021 won the Super Bowl, but the 2020 defense stood alone. And he was able to install those concepts in a COVID year for the Rams. I mean, the league was very impressed with what Brandon Staley did from a schematic standpoint defensively in 2020. Obviously, running the 3-4 linebackers dropping in coverage, different stuff up front. The 49ers want to maintain what they're doing up front with Chris Kasarik, with how their linebackers are operating under Johnny Holland, but they would certainly love to add some of the advanced coverage concepts that they think that Brandon Staley can bring. In short, this is the 49ers' goal. The 49ers are aiming for the union that they could not attain with Steve Wilks. When Wilks came in, the idea was build your own secondary, combine it with our coverage, let's go. The problem is that the defense regressed significantly under Steve Wilks from number 1 to number 12. Wilks was using Fred Warner, the linebacker, in a lot more of a safety coverage role, and that really compromised the 49ers' run defense. The run defense went from number 1 to number 27, or number 2 to number 27 on the season. I mean, number 27 run defense is not going to get the job done. It's not going to be good for the pass rushers because they're going to be in bad down and distance. They're not going to be able to pin their ears back nearly as much. Steve Wilks's lack of emphasis on the run game and the slippage of run defense really hurt the 49ers, and they want to make sure that they get back to premium run defense, and that's what they want to combine with the new pass defense concepts that they believe that Brandon Staley can bring to the table. Now, as far as being able to meld those with who's calling plays, we got to remember Nick Sorensen is the one calling plays. I think one of the reasons the 49ers really love Sorensen is because of his versatile background. I talk about him being Michael Vick's predecessor at quarterback at Virginia Tech. Well, look at Brian Fleury, the 49ers tight ends coach. He was a college quarterback at Towson University. You might think that being a college quarterback has nothing to do with being a tight ends coach, but Kyle Shanahan wants everybody to see the game from the position of the quarterback, which is obviously the most important spot on the field. If you could see the game from the position and the vantage point of a quarterback with all the rules that protect quarterbacks, with the way that offensive football is evolving, even on the defensive side, if your coordinator can see the game from the quarterback's vantage point, Kyle Shanahan believes that gives you a leg up in the chess match. And I think that when you look at Nick Sorensen, between being a college QB, then moving to be a special teams ace over a long career, nearly a decade in the NFL, he was a safety and a special teams ace from about 2000 to 2009, 2010. When you look at that variety of experiences before he even entered his coaching career, Kyle Shanahan believes that he has somebody who's going to be an adept play caller because he understands the different forces at play at all corners of the football field. Sorensen has been a special teams coordinator in a pinch in 2021 when Brian Schneider, who's actually now the 49ers defensive special teams coordinator, had a step away from Jacksonville. Sorensen took over for that unit, but he's mainly been a defensive assistant over his time in the NFL. He even spent some time with the Seattle Seahawks under Pete Carroll. The 49ers gave him those defensive pass game coordinator duties this past year. So he wasn't directly play calling, but he had Nick Sorensen reached a new level of schematics defensively. He was part of the scheming for the 49ers defense at a higher level than he had previously been. That showed that he was rising within the 49ers power structure. And now we see Nick Sorensen at the top. He's going to be the defensive coordinator, and he's going to be there alongside Brandon Staley, the Vic Fangio disciple, as the 49ers try to meld different ideas at the top of that defense. The idea is keep the system, but fix the regression. So keep the system 4-3, Chris Kasarik, defensive front, wide 9, all that good stuff, but add what Brandon Staley can add, and then fix the regression that the 49ers saw under Steve Wilks. Because this was a team with the number 1 offense last season, but the number 12 defense is ultimately what made the 49ers not quite as balanced, I think, as they were at their very peak in 2022. The run defense was way worse. The defense as a whole obviously was good, but definitely not great. The offense might have been better than 2022, but you had some slippage on the defensive side of the ball that the 49ers would like to fix. They're looking for that union between they're looking for that union between the front end and the back end defensively. All right, so the 49ers hire both Nick Sorensen and Brandon Staley. I am going to take some questions here as we talk about this hire. It is early on Saturday morning, 7:06 on the West Coast. I've already written an article about this, and now I'm talking about it. So why don't we open this up to a Q&A? So I am ready for your questions. Let's go. Staley, assistant head coach, likely. Nick Sorensen, defensive coordinator. What's for breakfast? I think Margot's making French toast. I'm hungry. I haven't had a chance to eat yet because I woke up and I saw this news and I got right to work. Why does John Lynch drink so many water bottles before press conferences? Because he's a healthy guy. You're supposed to drink a lot of water. What's wrong with that? Maybe you should take his example. Why is this a good move? I don't know if it's a good move or a bad move. I can just tell you what the move is. And the move is keeping the defensive system with a bright young coach named Nick Sorensen and bringing in an accomplished defensive coordinator to try to elevate the system to a new level. The accomplished defensive coordinator and Brandon Staley is going to be probably the assistant head coach. You know, it's a similar title or the same title as Anthony Lynn. The 49ers will, this is a cool connection. The 49ers are set to have two straight assistant head coaches who are ex-head coaches of the Chargers. Anthony Lynn used to be the Chargers head coach, was the 49ers assistant head coach, and he helped coordinate the run game over the past 2 seasons. Anthony has gone to Washington. He's now with the Commanders. That's where Adam Peters went. And Brandon Staley is now on the 49ers staff as assistant head coach, also an ex-Chargers head coach. Now, Staley is a Vic Fangio disciple. Vic Fangio was obviously Jim Harbaugh's defensive coordinator for the 49ers about 10 years ago. Guess who the Chargers head coach succeeding Brandon Staley is? Jim Harbaugh. So all this coaching stuff is very, very intertwined. What are my honest thoughts on Staley? I've just been talking about Staley for the last 20 minutes. Why would you need more thoughts right now? I mean, he's coordinated the best defense in the league in 2020. His one time being a coordinator. Doesn't seem like he was a very good head coach. Things didn't work out with the Chargers, but the 49ers aren't hiring him to be a head coach. They're hiring him to be an assistant coach, and they're hiring him to work with this defense and infuse some of his coverage concepts with the defense. This is what Ted Nguyen has said about Brandon Staley. Chargers Brandon Staley is polarizing, but his defensive game planning is elite. Yes, I did take action immediately. They're doing this because they're trying to deal with the Chiefs. That's who they have to go through. Yes, and Brandon Staley has seen success against the Chiefs as far as his defensive game planning goes. That's undeniable. Go back and watch some of those Chargers games against Kansas City. They gave Patrick Mahomes trouble for big chunks of those games. And again, one of those, they're 2-4. Staley was 2-4 against the Chiefs. One of those would have been a win had it not been for a Justin Herbert 99-yard pick six. That has nothing to do with Brandon Staley's defensive play calling. So with a worse team, Brandon Staley was almost 3-3 against the Chiefs, and he gave their offense some trouble with his defensive game planning. I think that you look at that if you're the 49ers. This entire interview process was very, very heavily influenced by collecting intel about the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, they even interviewed David Merritt, who's the DB coach of Kansas City. They were interested in Steve Spagnuolo, who is obviously the great defensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs. The 49ers flirted with him, according to Diana Rossini, in the couple days between the Super Bowl and when he got his extension with the Chiefs. So much of where the 49ers are at right now is like where the 49ers of the 1990s were. They lost 2 straight NFC championship games to the Cowboys. Carmen Policy famously said that offseason, if we lose to Dallas, we die. Well, if the 49ers lose to Kansas City again, it wouldn't be good. They're trying to overcome Kansas City. How do you overcome Kansas City? You look for creative ways to get better. The one area that really regressed for the 49ers this past season was their defense. So they fired Steve Wilks, and they have decided to run this slightly more complicated amendment to the defense at the defensive coordinator position. I know that Nick Sorensen is technically the DC, but bringing Brandon Staley in as assistant head coach is a wrinkle that, I think some of us might have expected, but it's not a wrinkle that is very common in the NFL to essentially bring in 2 guys to do this job. But it makes sense because the 49ers do want to overtake the Chiefs. They want to bring in some of that experience. They're going to have Nick Sorensen calling the defense, calling the plays, but they're going to be having Brandon Staley trying to infuse his ideas, which have been successful against Kansas City and other teams, including the 49ers in 2022 when the Chargers came in and played Sunday Night Football. They're going to have Brandon Staley come in and try to infuse those ideas into the defense. Who will be calling the plays on game day? That's the defensive coordinator, obviously. That's going to be Nick Sorensen. So you game plan by committee. You always game plan by committee. I mean, there's not only one guy game planning. This is Kyle Shanahan doesn't game plan the entire offense by himself. You game plan through multiple minds in the room, and then you have the one executive that is making the calls, and that's going to be Nick Sorensen. He is the defensive coordinator. Obviously relays the ideas to Fred Warner, who has the radio in his helmet, and then the 49ers execute from there. Last year, there seemed to be a communication issue between Warner and the defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks. That's why the 49ers moved Wilks up from the booth down to the field. To me, that was a lot of that, too, was just frustration that Wilks was not unifying Russian coverage with how he was talking to the linebackers. So the 49ers and Shanahan had to take some matters back into his own hands. I think at that point you saw that Steve Wilks' tenure with the 49ers would only be a season long. And they needed to get this right. They needed to tie the rush and the coverage together the way that it had been tied together from 2019 to 2022. And they've gone about trying to do that by promoting from within with Nick Sorensen and bringing in Brandon Staley from the outside. Okay, so the 49ers, I don't understand this. You say that the 49ers beat 98 to 99% of the league when healthy. So I think everybody already knows that that's where they're at right now. They need to beat the rest of the 1 to 2%. So they're trying to infuse new ideas. What about Brandon Staley wouldn't potentially allow the 49ers to get better? He's coordinated the top defense in the league in his one season as coordinator. Do people understand this? Staley was a defensive coordinator of the Rams in 2020. They have different coverage concepts than the 49ers. They were the number 1 defense in the league by a mile that year. He's an experienced coaching mind. He's a respected defensive coach. He's not coming in to be the defensive coordinator. He's coming in to infuse new ideas. I don't think there's anything really controversial about this at all. Yeah, you have 2 good defensive minds. I'm just now scanning some of this comment section, and I expect people to have incorrect opinions about stuff on the internet. That's just kind of how it works. But some of this stuff is really off the wall. I mean, nobody complained when the 49ers brought in Anthony Lynn as an assistant head coach. It wasn't like he was in some super influential role calling plays, play in, play out, leading the football team down in, down out, practice in, practice out. No, they brought him in because they thought he was a really good football mind that could help the collective of minds on that coaching staff. And that ended up being completely correct. The 49ers, with Anthony Lynn helping Kyle Shanahan scheme the run game, were the number one offense in football over the past season. So now they're bringing in Brandon Staley to help scheme the defense. You have to keep evolving. The league is a game of chess. And they think that Brandon Staley can help the defense improve from number 12 back to the top 3. They've got the talent. They believe they really do have the talent to be a top 3 defense. And they regressed under Steve Wilks. So they acknowledged their overambitiousness and mistake with Steve Wilks by trying to fit that square peg into a round hole. Now they're making sure that they're not doing that by promoting Nick Sorensen from within, so they run the existing scheme. So now they're going for that outside infusion by putting Brandon Staley in a position of less consequence than the position that Steve Wilks held. It's not like Staley's coming in with his 3-4 and being the defensive coordinator. He's coming in as an assistant head coach, and he's able to sprinkle his ideas in from that vantage point. That's the course correction that the 49ers have made. They realized that, probably not a good idea to bring the guy in as a DC, not let him bring any staff, and then have him try to shake everything up, even though he's a fish out of water. That didn't work last year with Steve Wilks. They dropped from number 1 to number 12. So they're trying a different approach this year because evolution, even though that didn't work, it's still important to evolve. So the evolution will have to happen this way for the 49ers. Steve Wilks absolutely regressed when it mattered. The 49ers defense was ranked number 12 last year, and their offense was number 1. 49ers offense put up the same amount of points as the Chiefs in regulation of that Super Bowl. There was one clear issue with this football team, and it was the defense last year, especially the run defense. That was the one clear issue. So the big regression happened from Steve Wilks. He's the one that got fired. Guys, there's not a conspiracy behind everything. Sometimes we can look at the truth and see what happened, and then the 49ers are trying to fix their one biggest flaw from last year. Darren says, Sorensen worked under Carroll during the Legion of Boom era, Seahawks for 7 seasons. It is a total scheme fit. Yes, that's true. He's also been with the 49ers, obviously, for 2 now. So he's got Legion of Boom pedigree, 4-3, cover 3, what have you. I think that we have to keep on emphasizing the fact that this guy was a college quarterback, though. From the play calling vantage point, that to me is really important for Kyle Shanahan. He loves Brian Fleury as the tight ends coach because Fleury is able to coach the tight ends and the nuances of their route running through the lens of what the quarterback is going to be seeing. Where do you need to be? How do you need to position your body so the quarterback is most comfortable, so the quarterback knows which way you're going to break, so the quarterback can put the ball to where you will be instead of where you currently are. That's so important for Shanahan to tie everything together on just the offensive side. I think philosophically, he thinks the same way defensively. I think he thinks that his defensive play caller, if he's a former quarterback, if he can see the game from multiple vantage points, and Nick Sorensen has been a special teams guy, he's been with the Legion of Boom Seahawks. He sees all of that. Kyle Shanahan thinks this is going to be a good executive. This is going to be somebody who can balance all interests as somebody calling the defense. And then he could take input from somebody like Brandon Staley. Shanahan can input too. The meeting of the minds when Shanahan interviewed Brandon Staley is apparently something that really impressed the 49ers because you've got this. You've got Staley, who's obviously been a polarizing figure as a head coach, but I think has had a lot of success as a defensive mind with the Chargers. You have this and the 3-4, the Fangio tree, which is obviously the opposite of the Legion of Boom system that Nick Sorensen is bringing. You take that, you meld it with Kyle Shanahan in the interview process. Supposedly, they bounced a lot of ideas off of each other. It apparently impressed Kyle Shanahan very much, and we know that Kyle Shanahan actually started with a defensive background in Tampa Bay back at the very early years of his NFL assistant coaching career under John Gruden. So that conversation yielded this two-headed monster approach. Nick Sorensen at the top as the play caller, Brandon Staley as somebody who can infuse new ideas into the defense. I do wonder if the 49ers bring back Sebastian Joseph Day now. He was a big Brandon Staley guy. That being said, I don't think they're going to be changing their front all too much. So Sebastian Joseph Day, defensive tackle for the Rams and then for the Chargers, joined the 49ers for the last few games after the 2023 season, after Brandon Staley was fired by the Chargers. He had to adapt, Joseph Day did, to the new 49ers front, moving from the 3-4 to the 4-3. It's unclear how much the 49ers front is going to evolve. I think Staley's probably going to influence the back end a little bit more. So if that's the case, if Staley's more of a back end guy and the front doesn't evolve all too much, I don't know if they're going to keep Sebastian Joseph Day around, because he was definitely more at home in the 3-4 scheme than with the 4-3 for the 49ers. Didn't play all too many snaps just because he couldn't make that transition. This right here is not true. The defense was good enough to win. If the 49ers defense was good enough to win, they would have won the game in the Super Bowl. They weren't good enough on defense. They weren't good enough on offense. They weren't good enough on special teams. No matter which way you shake it, by definition, the 49ers defense, because of the fumbles, because of the fact that the 49ers couldn't recover some of those fumbles, because of the blocked extra point, the defense wasn't good enough to win. The defense didn't make enough stops. They didn't stop Patrick Mahomes on that last drive. The defense might have played better than it had over the playoffs and some of those bad regular season games, but they weren't good enough to win. And, this is why we don't measure stuff by a one-game sample size. We measure stuff by the aggregate. And on the aggregate, the defense, it's undeniable. On the aggregate, the defense slipped from number 1 in 2022 under DeMeco Ryans to number 12 in 2023 under Steve Wilks. The defense regressed. If you regress in the NFL, you're probably going to get fired, period. Like all of this talk of the defense did a little bit better in the Super Bowl. What if Kyle Shanahan stepped in and had a major role in defensive game planning in the Super Bowl, and that's why they did a little bit better? I don't know if that's the case, but I mean, you don't know the details, so don't focus on one game to try to make an argument, especially if that game was a loss. No, the defense did not do enough in the Super Bowl. We can look at data over the course of a larger sample and see that the 49ers defense slid from 1 to 12 in overall EPA per play and from 2 to 27. From number 2 to 27 in run defense. You're not going to win Super Bowls ranked number 27 in run defense. It wasn't good enough under Steve Wilks, which is why the 49ers have done what they did today. They had an ambitious idea with Steve Wilks. They wanted to infuse the back end with new coverage combinations. They're going to try to do that by hiring Brandon Staley as an assistant head coach, because he's seen a lot of defensive success in the past as a defensive coordinator. That 2020 Rams defense was number 1 by a mile in the NFL. And they want to maintain what they've been doing with a new defensive play caller, the new executive at the top of that power structure, and Nick Sorensen, who's been with the Legion of Boom. That's obviously the predecessor of this 49ers defense. That's who Robert Saleh got the ideas from. Sorensen is going to be the play caller who's been with the 49ers now for the past 2 seasons, so they can try to not skip a beat as far as maintaining what they had before Steve Wilks. That's the idea. Anything else is just not looking at this situation correctly. Now, will this work? We'll see. Nobody's saying this is going to work for sure, or this is not going to. I'm explaining strategy right now. I'm explaining what the 49ers are thinking. And to say, a lot of what I see as far as criticism goes is just not based in any sort of actual tangible reality at the moment. You can't go out and say that Brandon Staley is going to have a negative impact on the defense because he was the Chargers head coach and they had a losing record, because he's not going to be the head coach of the 49ers. He's an assistant coach who's helping game plan with the defense. So any discussion of somebody like Brandon Staley should be zeroed in on his defensive schematic capabilities, because that's the actual job that he'll be doing with the 49ers. He's not going to be a head coach. What does cloud coverage mean when they talk about Staley's defense? Cloud coverage is essentially disguised coverage. So man coverage, that's actually zone coverage, and zone coverage, that's actually man coverage. What looks to be zone coverage is actually man coverage. A lot of that kind of stuff. It's complex combinations on the back end. Steve Wilks brought some coverage combinations to the back end for the 49ers that they hadn't run before. And the hope is that Brandon Staley does so in a more sophisticated way that takes the 49ers defense and the back end up another level. One thing is that, Steve Wilks wasn't all bad for the 49ers defense. They did regress on the aggregate. The run defense got way worse, but I thought that the cornerbacks, both of them, played the best football of their careers, Charvarius Ward and Diamador Lenore. That was really good stuff for the 49ers, right? What you saw from the corners last year. Wilks was a good hands-on coach. I thought some of the more complex coverage combinations that he delivered on the back end did register big plays for the 49ers. They were up near the league lead in interceptions once again. I mean, there was definitely good stuff for the 49ers in the secondary, but it wasn't tied in with that front nearly well enough. In fact, it was a bit of a mess, I would say, when you try to tie it in with that front. That's the only way that they could get better. That's the only way that they could get better secondary play while seeing worse defensive play. It was a combination that didn't make sense under Steve Wilks. You got better with the corners. You're picking off just as many passes, but your defense slides, and that's because they're using Fred Warner in too much of a safety role instead of a linebacker role. They weren't stopping the run at a level that they needed to stop it at. Sliding to number 27 in run defense was unacceptable for the 49ers, especially in a Super Bowl contending year. So when you look at the cloud coverages that Brandon Staley runs, the 49ers want him to infuse that next level of coverage into their defense, but they don't want to lose the ability to stop the run that they did lose this past year. They need to remain an elite run defense. That's especially with the way that the league is going right now. Teams are running the ball so much more effectively than just a couple years ago. I think that there's a trend that is going back toward toward punishing run offense, to punish these run defenses who, defenses have downsized over the years. They've gotten faster to combat the spread offense. So you've got to be able to play the run. You absolutely do, because the way that things are evolving, even the Chiefs are more of a ground and pound team than they were in the past. And the 49ers are going to count on Staley to deliver his cloud coverage concepts within the context of also delivering against the run. And I think a lot of that's going to lie on Nick Sorensen's shoulders as the defensive coordinator. All right, fun stuff. It's a good show. 49ers hired both Nick Sorensen and Brandon Staley. We're going to get to you guys in a little bit. Thanks again. 49ers have finally made moves on the defensive coordinator front. We will talk to you soon.